As we arrive at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua is an old man. He's 110 years old, and he's reflecting back on all the ways that God has been good, and so he gathers up all the people of Israel, including their leaders, and he gives them one final farewell address. And in this final farewell speech, he encourages them to reflect on the past, examine the present, and navigate their future. And so as we look at this final speech, I want us to break it down into those three sections, and each one of these sections will have a key word. As we begin by looking at the past, the key word is the word remember. Joshua wants Israel to remember. Remember all the ways that their Creator God has been faithful, all the ways that God has been good to them. Make a catalog of everything that God has done on their behalf. He begins by gathering them at a location known as Shechem. In Joshua 24, verse 1, we read, "Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God." Now, we might look at that verse and think, well, this is just kind of the setup, the background, the introduction, but there's a little bit more going on here. The location of Shechem is a pretty significant location for the people of Israel in Joshua's day. Two important events had already taken place at Shechem. Back in Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham to leave his family and go to a land he will one day show him. And a few verses later, Abraham arrives at Shechem underneath the great tree. And there, God says, although right now there are Canaanites living in the land, Abraham, look around. One day, everything that you see will belong to your descendants. And in light of God's promise to Abraham, Abraham grabs some stones and he builds an altar right there at Shechem. This altar was a reminder of God's faithfulness, everything that Abraham believed God would one day do. Event number 2. Fast forward 2 generations to Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Jacob is coming back to the land after leaving for a while, and he's coming back with his family, and he stops underneath an oak tree at Shechem, and he addresses his family. He tells them, "Take all these foreign gods, these family gods that you've been carrying around, and let's throw them away. Let's get rid of them." And so they do. They dig a hole and they bury them in the ground right there underneath an oak tree at Shechem. So Shechem is a symbolic place that reminds them of God's faithfulness, but also encourages them to throw away other gods, any competition, any alternatives to the one true God. 2 themes that are going to be really significant in this final chapter. And then as Joshua begins to speak, he traces their history. Reminder after reminder of God's faithfulness. Now, I'm not going to read all of the verses, but let me just give kind of a flyover from verse 2 through verse 13. In verses 2 through 4, Joshua takes us back to the days of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, reminding us of all the ways God was faithful in those generations. In verses 5 through 7, he takes us back to Moses and the plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea on dry ground, the wandering in the wilderness all those years, and reminds us of all the ways that God has been faithful. And then in verses 8 through 10, they move just outside the Promised Land, just on the other side of the Jordan River, where they face 2 enemy kings, Sihon and Og, who attack the people of Israel. And God is faithful. God delivers them. And then in verses 11 through 13, Joshua brings them to their almost current day, recent events that they witnessed with their own eyes in their lifetime. The crossing of the Jordan River on dry ground, the defeat of Jericho, as God took out enemy king after wicked enemy king. For 12 verses, Joshua says, remember the Creator, remember God's faithfulness, remember how good He has been. Now, you might look at verse 12 and you might see a phrase that seems a little strange depending on what translation you're looking at. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you. And you may be thinking, I don't remember there being a hornet, and a singular hornet doesn't seem like it would do a lot of damage. Hornet is probably a metaphor. In fact, some translations say terror or fear. And that's probably a pretty accurate translation for what the metaphor actually means. Back in Exodus, 2 different times, in Exodus 15 and then in Exodus 23, God uses that same imagery, the idea of sending terror or fear ahead of Israel into Canaan to stir up the people. In Miriam's song in Exodus 15, God says through that song that even though there are Canaanites living in the land, he's going to send terror ahead of Israel amongst the Canaanites. And then later in Exodus 23, the same idea. And if you recall, all the way back in Joshua chapter 2, Rahab reports that all the citizens of Jericho, they've heard reports about what God has been doing, and their hearts melted in fear. Terror went ahead of them. In chapter 5, the people, their hearts melt in fear, in terror. God sent terror ahead of Israel. In chapter 9, the Gibeonites, they deceive the Israelites and they form a treaty. Why? Terror, fear. In chapter 10, a coalition of kings forms against Israel because they were afraid. Terror went ahead of Israel into the land of Canaan. And so we see here 12 verses that highlight the faithfulness of God, and Joshua wants them to remember God's faithfulness, remember their Creator. Now, you may have not noticed that as I was giving you that flyover, but there are several first-person pronouns in these 12 verses where God is speaking through Joshua. Let me just highlight them as we walk through it. Verse 3, God says, I took your father Abraham. I gave him Isaac. Verse 4, to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country. Verse 5, I sent Moses and Aaron. I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there. I brought you out. Verse 6, I brought your people out of Egypt. Toward the end of verse 7, what I did to the Egyptians. Verse 8, I brought you to the land. I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them. Toward the end of verse 10, I delivered you out of his hand. The end of verse 11, I gave them into your hands. Verse 12, I sent the hornet. Verse 13, I gave you a land. Over and over, God, through Joshua, is reminding the people that he's been good, that he's been faithful. As they look back on the past, they remember. But as the speech begins to take a shift, to take a turn toward the present, we find a new keyword. We move from remember to reject. They are to reject any competing God, any alternative to the one true God. Let's read these famous words in Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. One of the most famous verses in all of Joshua, if not all of the Old Testament. But this section begins with Joshua challenging them to get rid of 2 types of gods. Type number 1, the gods that they worshipped beyond the Euphrates. This probably refers to gods that Abraham and his family brought with them as they entered into the land. It also probably refers to the household gods that Jacob and his family brought right to that very location and buried right there. And it seems that the people of Israel are still carrying around their kind of household trinket family gods. A second type of god they are encouraged to get rid of or throw away are the gods they acquired in Egypt. The people of Israel lived in Egypt for hundreds of years. you spend enough time in one place and you begin to assimilate to that culture. That culture begins to influence and impact you. And so naturally, some of the Israelites, they started carrying around some Egyptian gods. And here's the picture that Joshua is painting for us. As God is sending plague after plague in Egypt, showing that he is greater than the Egyptian gods, that the Egyptian gods are no gods at all, they're carrying around these trinket gods. As he parts the waters of the Red Sea, leading them across on dry ground, they're carrying around these trinket gods. As he leads them as a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud throughout the wilderness, they're behind, carrying their little trinket gods. And even in Joshua's day, in Joshua's generation, as they watch him firsthand hold up the waters of the Jordan River upstream, and they cross the Jordan River on dry ground, as they see God bring down the walls of Jericho, as they see God defeat wicked enemy king after enemy king, they're still carrying around these trinket family gods. And Joshua says it's time to make a decision. It's time to reject those alternatives, reject those competing gods. Anything that has kind of nudged out God and taken up residence in your heart, it's time to get rid of. Now, we might look at verses like this and commands like this, and we might think, well, that was back then. I don't really struggle with that temptation. I mean, I don't have trinket gods that I burn incense to and that I pray prayers to and that I offer sacrifices to. And while that may be an accurate statement, it doesn't mean you don't have gods that are tempting you. Every culture has its own gods. They just take different shapes. They just look a little different. In your culture, like mine, it may be gods like family. Some of us have this idealized picture of a perfect family, and we will do whatever we can to attain that perfect family. It's become a god to us. It's become the most important thing in our life. Then there's the God of friendship. There are some of us, we will cross any moral and ethical boundary or line to win the validation and the approval of our friends. More than anything else, we want their acceptance. And those friendships have taken on godlike status in our lives. For others, it's gods like money and material possessions and wealth. We live to accumulate more and more and more, and if God looked at the more and he said, would you be willing to get rid of that for me? Many of us would struggle, and that might indicate that it's taken on godlike status. Then there are the gods of entertainment and extracurriculars. Whenever you're extracurricular, maybe it's a sport that you play, maybe it's a hobby that you religiously are involved in. Whenever that extracurricular conflicts with your worship of God, you end up choosing your extracurricular. That might indicate it's risen to godlike status. Whenever we choose to be entertained over spiritual formation practices and habits, that might indicate that entertainment has risen to godlike status. And we could probably list a number of other potential gods in our culture. Political partisanship would be one, and on the list could go. And it's not that any of these matters, any of these things, any of these people are bad or wrong or evil. In fact, they're all good gifts from God. But when a good thing becomes a God thing, it becomes a wrong thing. And when that happens, we need to reject the competition. We need to recognize, first of all, that it's trying to squeeze its way into our lives, into our hearts, and we need to put it in its rightful place. But how do you know? How do you know if something has risen to godlike status in your life? I think there are a couple questions that we can be asking that can help us identify whether or not something has risen to godlike status. Question number one. If there's something that's been tempting us that we think maybe has risen to godlike status, if we look at that and we ask, if I lose this, if I lose everything else, but I still have God, is that enough? If the answer is yes, it probably hasn't risen to godlike status. Question number two, if whatever this is, if you ask the question, if I lose God, but I keep everything else, Would that be enough? And if the answer is yes, that's probably an indication that whatever this is, it has risen to godlike status. And if it has, it may mean that like the Israelites in Joshua's day, you got to get rid of whatever that God is. You've got to remove it, excise it from your life. It's also possible that God isn't calling you to fully remove it from your life. Maybe he's just calling you to reorient its value, that it doesn't take up residence as the central point of your life. It gets submitted to the lordship of Jesus. Whatever it looks like for you, these verses in Joshua call us to reject competitor gods, to identify and then put them in their rightful place. As the text continues on, there's kind of a back and forth between Joshua and the people of Israel. They say to Joshua, of course we will reject these other competing gods. Of course we will be faithful to God. He's the one who rescued us. He's the one who delivered us. And Joshua responds basically by saying, nah, I don't believe you. You're going to rebel. You're going to reject a God instead of rejecting the alternatives. And when you do, God is going to remove the covenant blessings and he's going to send the covenant curses. And they respond in verse 21, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua basically says, if you say so. I mean, your own words are going to testify against you. And they say, that's fine. Allow our words to testify against us. And so Joshua says in verse 23, now then, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. Joshua says there are two decisions that you need to make. Number one, you need to throw away the foreign gods. In the very same location that Jacob's family threw away and buried their family gods, their foreign gods, Joshua says, we need to do the same. Get rid of those gods, he says. Decision number two, fully submit your heart to the Lord. Pay close attention to how the Israelites respond in verse 24. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. They only respond to one of the two decisions that Joshua tells them to make. They say, sure, we'll fully surrender our hearts to the Lord. We'll do that. But there's no mention of them being willing to throw away, to get rid of their competing gods. And if you read through the rest of the chapter, and then even on into Judges and in later parts of the Old Testament, it's pretty clear that they don't fully remove those alternative gods. They keep on worshiping them. And I think this ending to the book of Joshua is meant to caution us. It's meant to challenge us. It tells us to serve and obey, we must put away other gods today. We can't wait. We can't keep clinging to them. We've got to put them in their rightful place. If we want to serve and obey God faithfully, we've got to be willing to reject the competition. As Joshua encourages them to examine their present, he says, identify those gods that are taking up residence and then put them in their rightful place. As we move toward the future, the key word is the word renew. Joshua encourages the people of Israel to renew their vows, to renew their commitment to the Lord. He builds an altar in verse 25 and 26. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. Joshua makes a covenant. He renews the vows, gives the people of Israel a chance to renew their vows, to renew their commitment. And then he takes a stone and he sets it up as an altar. It's the 9th time in the book of Joshua that a stone or a group of rocks is mentioned and plays an important role. And here, this stone is an altar, a monument, right near a tree. And if you think back to what I mentioned earlier about Abraham and Jacob, both of them had significant events right there at a tree. Abraham had built a stone altar right near the great tree at Shechem as a reminder of God's faithfulness. And right next to a tree, Jacob buries the family's foreign gods. And here at this tree, possibly same tree, possibly in the same area, we have Joshua doing likewise. Building a monument, building a memorial, one large stone that reminds them of God's faithfulness and encourages them to reflect on and renew their commitment, their covenant. You and I, we probably don't have our own stone altar, but we have a way that we renew our vows with God. Some of us renew our vows on a weekly basis, some of us on a monthly basis, some of us a quarterly basis, but every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion, we are, in effect, renewing our commitment, renewing our vows, based on the one who first made a commitment to us. And then we have the last 5 verses of the book. In the final few verses of the book, well, the book ends the same way that it began, with death. In chapter 1, verse 1, we would read, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord." And in these final 5 verses, we see 3 deaths, or rather 2 deaths and 1 bone burial. The death of Joshua, the burial of Joseph's bones, and the death of Eleazar the priest. Let's start with Eleazar and let's move backwards. Eleazar was to Joshua what Aaron was to Moses. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was the priest, and he was Moses' right-hand man. Eleazar, the priest, is Joshua's right-hand man. The mention of Eleazar here is meant to draw a parallel between the life and ministry of Moses and the life and ministry of Joshua. Then we have Joseph's bones, probably mentioned for 2 reasons. One of those reasons is that Joseph died at 110 years old, the same age that Joshua dies, 110. There's a parallel between Joshua and Joseph. The second reason why Joseph is mentioned is because back in Genesis 50, as Joseph himself is getting older, he is near his deathbed, he makes his relatives promise that after he dies, whenever God leads the people into the land he had promised, they would take his bones and they would give it a proper burial. The mention of his bones being buried is a sign that God has been faithful to keep his promise. God has been true to his word. And then we have Joshua himself. We read about Joshua's death in verse 29. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. Joshua is referred to as the servant of the Lord. But back in chapter 1, he was simply referred to as Moses' assistant. And finally, here at the end of the book, he is referred to as the servant on the Lord. He has finally risen to Moses-like status. And yet, like Moses, Joshua is unable to fully realize the promises of God. By the end of the book, we see that they don't fully possess the land. Joshua doesn't bring them into true and permanent rest. And so at the end of the book of Joshua, we find ourselves hoping for a greater Moses, a greater Joshua or Yeshua, one who would bring a heavenly rest, one who will bring a true and greater future, one who will bring a true and greater inheritance. As the book of Joshua concludes, we find ourselves as readers waiting for the coming of the greater Joshua.